Problem I'm having is my second monitor is being taken over by the presenter view, and I want to be able to see me deco.
Okay. Your
That's also not helpful.
I'm going to give Care just a few minutes to appear.
Okay, looks like I'm just going to be running on maximized view. Good morning, everybody. If you wish to test your microphone, now is a good chance. Appears we have temporarily lost G.
I suspect he'll be online. Let me pop into another window and see if we can find, if I can get the meeting note-taking tool. Okay, I get one or the other.
Yeah, you're not able to display both at the moment.
Okay, I'm going to stay in presentation mode. Okay.
For everyone joining, we'll be getting started in just a moment.
Let me know if you see K, or otherwise we'll start at 5 after.
He is not currently in the list.
Okay.
And we have about another minute or so. If anybody would care to test their microphone at this time, please feel free to do so.
Apparently everyone's shy today.
We can hear you, Warren.
Or asleep.
Now, this is very early for some people and late for others. Our usual problem.
You considered living on a flat earth? Then
I think the cats would knock everything off of it.
Yes.
My cats. They get locked out during this session, but my daughter has them try to sit in the keyboard at the right time.
Okay, I am going to send a quick text message to Kayer, and otherwise I suggest we get started.
I can send the quick message to Care and you, if you wish, or did
Okay.
you already send it?
Just sent it. Okay.
Okay.
Well, shall we?
Yep, we should start.
Okay. Good solar rotation to everybody. We're here for a interim specifically to discuss the fate of FlowSpec and what we do with it as we decide to work on it for new features. The interim is titled FlowSpec V2, partially because that was the work that Sue helped seed a few years back as we were having these discussions about what happens after FlowSpec V1 and which pieces could or could not be done in FlowSpec V2. The format of the interim is basically going to be a quick set of discussion, basically is a here's where we were. Please feel free to ask questions during this, but my recommendation is I have maybe less than 10 minutes worth of slides, and the majority of the point for this interim is discussion about what we think we should do. Unfortunately, Robert Drashuk is not going to be showing, and he was one of the people that was very opinionated about what we did. We'll channel the few comments that he did actually make just before meeting started so that his points are at least captured in the minutes and maybe discussed, but hoping for good discussion about what we do. Any agenda bashing before we get started? Okay, seeing nobody seizing the microphone. So the current state of things, FlowSpec V2, Sue did a quick draft, almost 5 years ago now, covering some of the things that we could not do with FlowSpec at the time that were being considered important for next generation FlowSpec. Probably the most interesting thing that was one of the bigger pieces of fallout from the work that gave us 8955 as we did the FlowSpec V2 work was we ended up dealing with the fact that there was an intent for FlowSpec to be an opaque NLRI. And the problem with opaqueness is it just turned out that nobody was willing to implement it in that fashion. So as a consequence of that, we did end up removing the opaqueness from 8955, which left us with the interesting problem of what to do about it. For FlowSpec V2, one of the options is to move to a full TLV format. PCEP, when they were implementing their ability to do flow matching as part of their mechanism, borrowed FlowSpec encodings, but they also made sure that each FlowSpec component type was put into a separate TLV field. BGP-wise, this puts us in an interesting situation if we move to this type of behavior, borrowing a bit of terminology from CBOR. We have a possibility for a well-formed, this is a valid TLV, but invalid in case the contents are not taken care of. So this will be a thing we'll have to discuss and potentially impacts things like BGP error handling from RC 7606. Several of the FlowSpec use cases that we had pop up in the prior years depended on rule ordering. And today FlowSpec does a default sort order that is reasonably well set for distributed denial of service mitigation. It's not terribly good for generic firewall behaviors. And even for the DDoS node situations, there are some combinations of rules that the field has noticed that simply don't optimize very well for various implementations. And of course, that's an implementation issue, but it's a thing that actually needs to be dealt with. Actions were one of the things that we did some work as part of working on FlowSpec biz. And some of this is that we've added things like interface set, redirect IP. Now, these things haven't quite made it through the RFC process, but several of them are well deployed. One of the things that sort of cropped up as part of each of these pieces of work was that how do these things interact with each other? What's the precedence? What's the priority? How do they stack together? Those specific examples, the redirect features, had to spell out very specifically, if you had more than one copy of the rule, what is it intended to do? The FlowSpec v2 draft from a few years ago, sort of hand waves that we're going to throw it into a wide community. What we really need is ability to remove ambiguity for when there's conflicting behaviors. A big portion of the work that actually did go into 8955, as you look through the actions, is there's a lot of discussion about how things avoid conflicting with each other. We also have an interesting thing that FlowSpec interface set provided a feature that probably would go into NLRI in terms of matching purposes, but it was a behavior that needed to be able to change on a potentially AS by AS or maybe even a hop by hop basis, and that couldn't be done if you stuck into the NLRI. And we're seeing that in terms of other interactions of BGP proposed features, like BGP car as an example. We talked about the conflicting redirect actions. When we were discussing FlowSpec v2, the encoding challenges were our biggest problems that we could easily deal with. I threw together a couple of quick drafts that make some proposals about how we could deal with some of these things, maybe without having the need a brand new v2 format. We ended up with a lot of very good discussion on the mailing list as part of this. The two separate features was basically a capability bits, which allows us to say, how does one implementation talking to another handle being able to parse things? And this deals with the opaqueness problem that we had before. The FlowSpec v2 format is definitely on the cleaner side of things, but part of the discussion point that the capability bits also brought us is, what do you do when you don't understand things as a new component? We'll talk about that momentarily in an upcoming slide. Term ordering ended up being a relatively easy thing to wedge into the existing FlowSpec v1 plumbing without any problems, as long as you have something like the capability bits to allow it to be sent. Asian, I saw your microphone flash a second. Do you have a question? Okay, as we're seeing you come up, you're being shown as muted. I see that there's a item in the chat. So we'll continue, see if we can work through the microphone issues in a moment. The other question that we had is, this was sort of a new piece of question that we had in the last week or so. One of the big pieces of complexity in the FlowSpec RFC is dealing with customer-injected eBGP routes. And it's not a common use case. It's almost never seen at this point, but an awful lot of the validation procedures are wound up into supporting that. The FlowSpec OID document provides mechanisms to shut that off. So the discussion that we had about the capability bits seeded the discussion about what we should do about incrementally deploying new features. And we had some very good discussions there. And some of these things are separable. So for example, being able to parse a new component. What do you do in terms of being able to handle the parsing for that? With the capability bits, you provide at least the indication that you theoretically can parse a thing. If it's opaquely held in a TLV that you may or may not understand, either at the adjacent hop or further in your network via route reflector, well, we now have some additional error handling components. This is sort of the damage from afar that RFC 7606 was trying to mitigate. We also have implementing the component. So it may be possible, as an example, for an implementation to understand how to parse a new feature, but due to hardware issues, may not be able to implement it for some reason. So what do you do in those circumstances? And part of the discussion that came up as part of the 8955 work that ties very much into incremental new features is, What do you do when you don't understand something and you can't install it? FlowSpec basically says you just simply don't install the rule chain that is compiled from it. But the problem you have with that is if the rules are not independent, you could end up with holes in the rule set. And depending on what the intent of those rules may be, you may end up with misfiltering. So that's an interesting deployment challenge. And to some extent, these things as a collection highlight that we have a not well-defined FlowSpec domain. Here's a set of routers that participate in FlowSpec that may understand specific features and may have an ability, even if they understand them, to deploy them or not deploy them. So that impacts the discussion as well. One of the things that was not discussed but is equally important is component IDs in our default sort determine where they go in the sorting order. This means that as we add new features, we have to decide what component ID they get, and this potentially can impact how they actually get installed in the default sort order. Once we have a feature that can explicitly do the term orders, it's less important. One of the biggest challenges we're going to have, even once we've decided what the extension mechanisms look like, is how do things interact with a completely boring, and plain, 8955 compliant FlowSpec v1. So operationally, the motivation for discussing this is really, what do you do about term ordering? That was an example. If you have FlowSpec v1 that doesn't support term order, and you have a FlowSpec v2, which is a required feature, where do the rules sort next to each other? This can mean in some circumstances that a FlowSpec speaker might actually have both FlowSpec v1 routes and routes with extensions, whether that's a FlowSpec v2 and a different SAFI, or even something using the additional capability extensions that were discussed in the previous slides. The question becomes, do these things mix? Are they allowed to be in different pools? Should they be allowed to interact with each other in terms of sort order? And this becomes an interesting set of questions. So that's the full set of discussion points that we have at this point. The discussion I'd like to motivate today is, what do we want in terms of these interactions? How should new features interact? We want to know, what should we do about parsing of these things? And the motivation for this long term is, once we know what the interactions should look like, do we actually need a new SAFI to encode these things? And that's the total contents of the presentation. Let's go ahead and open up the floor and see if we have initial discussion.
Our real question here is, initially when we looked at this, we picked up the fact that we needed to go to a V2 to get to ordering and to handle the actions in the new components. Jeff has proposed a couple things that will allow us a stepwise progression, and we need some feedback on what needs to happen from operators. I made the mistake of not bundling enough into V1. And so we had 3 drafts. The OID is just finishing, has been approved by the IETF by now. So now we're ready to go to that next step. We need some feedback, because a flag day is always not necessarily a good thing. Any thoughts on the questions of new features? We're taking a pause here before we dash either into V2 or dash into a stepwise component that Jeff has laid out. early in the morning, but we have some people to whom it's late at night and some people to whom it's middle of the morning. Weibo and G, could you perhaps, you're next in the queue. Jeff, I'll let you manage the queue for the net.
Okay. Haibo, you're at the top of the queue.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Yeah, I have a question about the incremental deployment. I think here the number third said that about the rule are not independent. Misfiltering may happen across the host. But my question is that for which scenario it will happen? Because at first the flow spec is used for firewall to avoid such as Ddos attack. So in this scenario, the rules may send to all the device. If we add a new component, we also want it to implement on all device. But if some device is old version, it don't support this new component. It can I think it can miss and it can miss this component is okay. But the other device supported can do it correctly. I think the first scenario. The second scenario is that I think now some solution use the flow spec to adjust the traffic. So when we do that, we also want to send the flow spec rules to specify routers. So it will not the rules will not actually effective on all the routers. It only effect on some specified routers. So some routers like router selector don't support the new component. I think it's also okay, but it just need to send the flow route to the correct router. I think then rules can be effective. This is my question.
Okay, so you were partially dropping out, but I did think I got most of your questions. So it sounds like the first question you had is maybe an example for an independent rule. Is that correct? Okay, you've lost the mic queue again. So I'll give an example of rule dependence and maybe make it an easy thing to see. So even without having any new flow spec features, think about what happens if you accidentally filter a flow spec route. Consider the case where you have a rule that matches a destination, 10/8, and is just simply doing rate limiting. But you have a specific host in there that is 10.111/32 that is intended to be permitted to go at full speed. So you're poking a hole in the firewall. Well, this is a very common thing that people do for firewalls. If for some reason you end up losing the more specific rule based on the sort ordering, you'll end up with misfiltering. And in cases for new features, we see something very similar. If you don't understand a given feature, you may end up doing misfiltering there. So that's what's intended about the problems for independent rules. I think the second piece of question I heard from you was the partial deployment problem. And part of what we have is tools for flow spec distribution of routes. There are two common ways that routes are distributed in flow spec domains right now, in my experience. The first one is that there is a route reflector plane that is set up for distributing the flow spec routes. So all of the routers currently get a consistent set of rules within that route reflector plane. The second one is routes are basically targeted. So a firewall controller, for example, may send a FlowSpec route to a specific router, and it contains the BGP no advertise attribute in there, so that it does not propagate any further. So the targeted one is obviously an easy way for us to incrementally deploy new features, and especially if we have something like a capability, whether it's the bits one that I'm suggesting or something else that gives the supported functionality. It becomes possible for BGP session to, for at least that router by router basis, decide whether it can distribute things. I think the more challenging scenario is when we actually have distribution by a route reflector. If we have non-matching capabilities, certainly features like the FlowSpec bits can sort of cause an appropriate pruning to happen within the domain. But it may suggest that for certain combinations of features, that we may end up needing multiple planes. And we're already sort of seeing a push towards that paradigm anyway. As an example, the L2 VPN FlowSpec is a different SAFI. There's no reason that a set of BGP speakers that speak L2 VPN FlowSpec have to be the same set of routers that support some other extension, as an example. Did you have any follow-up, Ibo?
I'm not catch all your answer, but I can more.
Okay, we will try to capture that in the minutes, make sure that we discuss that further on the mailing list. Jean, you have your hand raised.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you.
Okay, yeah. I agree that incremental deployment of the new FlowSpec features is a new important capability. We have some observations about the deployment of the FlowSpec. In my understanding that usually the scope of the FlowSpec announcement is within a single domain or under control of a single administrator. So maybe the security issue with the unknown FlowSpec component can be controlled by the operator or the administrator properly. This is so. With this assumption that we think we need to also consider whether we can have the RRs to propagate the FlowSpec rules, even if it does not support this, some components within this FlowSpec rules. This may be similar to the new route types in the EVPN address family. Think about you can propagate a new route type from one PE to another PE through the route reflector. Another thing is we also think the filters usually does not need to be implemented by every hop along the propagation path. So like we can maybe either designate the target nodes which need to implement this FlowSpec rules, and the other nodes along the path may just need to propagate these FlowSpec rules to the next hop without no need to implement it and without need to fully understand all the components within it. This way, maybe it can better support the incremental deployment of the new features in some of the network scenarios. This is my some understanding about this incremental deployment.
Okay, thank you. So a few comments on that. Certainly one of the problems that we have is just simply understanding what devices support being able to parse something, and once parsing has been handled, whether if the device is capable of implementing it. So your point is valid, that it may not be required in many cases for every single device to know how to implement a specific thing. As an example, the interface set feature that's supported by a couple of vendors now allows FlowSpec routers to take the routes and distribute them, but not necessarily apply them at every single device. But that sort of goes to your second point, where if you actually have a FlowSpec domain where for some reason you can't inconsistently apply filters, then you may or may not have a problem based on that. So the main challenge is being able to figure out whether something is safe, and even if it is under a single administrator control, can your tooling tell whether something is safe to build a specific rule set?
You mean that for some kind of rules, the inconsistency, even within the domain, is still important?
It may depend. And this is one of those, I gave the example of even a simple filter, for existing FlowSpec. If you're designing your FlowSpec rules for specific purposes, as an example, just DDoS, you're less likely to run into these sorts of problems. But as you start doing things that are closer to standard firewall behaviors, where rule ordering becomes much more important, it becomes much more of a problem.
Okay, maybe we can have some more detailed analysis about some cases which can have this kind of issues, so that we can have better understanding about this problem. Yeah.
Okay. I will take an action to add an example on the mailing list. I believe it's in one of my drafts as well.
Okay, thank you.
Christoph?
Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Great. Are we only discussing about the incremental deployment, or?
We're discussing what's the motivations for anything that is the changes for FlowSpec beyond what we currently have.
Fine. Okay, fine. One thing that I'm not sure if it's on the slides that I wanted to note is, currently we have like multiple ways to encode the very same match condition in BGP FlowSpec, and I wonder if it's worth noting that, or if it's worth addressing this issue in V2, because I think this is not in the slides.
It is not.
Like the example for that is like we can have port 1, for example, IP port 1 or port 2 or port 3, or we can also have range, and which is on the firewall side, it's the same behavior, but it's different rules. So there is no single form of FlowSpec NLRI to explain one same thing.
Agreed. And being a coder for one of the implementations that sort of rudely will accept one FlowSpec route and change it into a second FlowSpec route,
right.
This can be an interesting problem, and certainly that's worth discussing as a thing that we can do for V2, since if we actually do a major revision, that's a perfect place to do it. We also do, I think, have the option to just simply put out a informational document discussing what to do, because it's not necessarily a protocol change. It's just recommending how to have a more canonical encoding for things.
Right. Okay, I just wanted to note this because I wasn't sure if it's on the slide. So it's in there.
At the moment, nothing is out of scope.
Yeah.
So I'm going to call out somebody, Sergey. It's my belief from the comments you did during adoption that you thought that we should defer some of this work towards V2. Since you expressed a positive opinion about this, could you spend a few moments to discuss that, because I think that sort of ties into the discussion we're trying to have. It was not necessarily fair to call him out, but I suspect we've caught him sleeping. So, Donald, you have the microphone.
Hi. Yeah. So I make a very high level, maybe slightly radical comment, but I just sort of wonder these various things that can be done incrementally, which are all steps and clear improvements and things like that. It seems to me they tend to necessarily be a little bit of a compromise of what you would like to do if you had a clean slate, and be a little more complicated and we interact more than they should with other features and other potential additions. And you get several of these. I just wonder if things will get too complicated, and I sort of want to make a kind of a general plug for going for something that's a little more radical with a new FlowSpec V2, so to speak. And some speakers would speak one of the old, and some would speak the new, and I think you can manage that, because otherwise you have some speakers speak the old, and some speakers also speak chain delta 1 to the old, and some speakers also speak delta 2 to the old, and some speakers also speak delta 3 to the old, and that's actually worse than some just speak the old and some speak the new in some ways. Yeah, I guess going on a little bit further, I think that it's interesting to hear what everybody thinks. I welcome comments from everybody else, but I think probably we need to have some drafts. I was going to say competing drafts. I don't have to. I guess cooperative drafts, whatever. I don't know. We need multiple drafts, I think, that can be kind of put together after discussion, or pieces from each or whatever, to really end up with a conclusion for this. So this is a good preliminary discussion, but I think we'll have to have some future additional interim or the like to make real progress based on specific drafts. That's it.
What specific drafts would you like to see, Donald? Are you looking for a V2 proposal versus just proposals? What are you? How can we move this forward? Is the real question, because we were trying to see.
Thing for me to do is to put my money where my mouth is and write a proposal.
Well, I know that Christoph might be I'm not going to speak for Christoph, but you might want to chat with him. He's
okay.
Interested in the same, but we're trying to give some scoping, folks, on. We had when we did the V1 drafts, everyone had your comment, Donald, and the chairs have been Jeff and Kare, and I have been trying to prepare for either doing V2 by looking at all these questions and saying, why do you really need it? Do the operators really want a V2 that skips, or do they want to just roll things forward? And so we were hoping we'd get comments from implementers, from operators, on what made sense. The adage in woodwork is measure twice, cut once. I think that's what we're asking. Is we're about to undertake this work. Is it V2 what operators want, or is a migration that Jeff proposed more acceptable? And we're looking for some solid feedback. Our general, if people are willing to go ahead and write drafts that may or may not go forward because we don't have this guidance, that's great, but we're trying to move in that direction. So hopefully I'm stirring the pot for some more comments, folks, especially if you're an operator or someone who's implementing. If you just give us some hints on what to do next.
So Donald took himself out of the microphone queue, but to respond to you, Donald, one of the things that this conversation is partially about is exactly what you're talking about. Do we go for clean slate, no second SAFI, take all the good ideas that we had and enable things to go more radical, or do we just creep ahead one incremental feature at a time? And I think that's a fair question. That's big portion of what we're trying to motivate. When we originally did the V2 draft, we knew that minimally that term ordering was a thing that we really wanted, that just simply couldn't be done in the existing mechanism. And we have a possible option for it at the very least. One of the other things I think impacts everybody, so like FlowSpec NVO3 and L2 VPN as examples. If you wanted to add those sort of things, does that mean that those drafts stay on pause until we end up with a FlowSpec V2, or do we do a new version of them afterwards? Does that mean that each of those SAFIs need to get additional extensions? If it can go into the NLRI and the sort of term order hack that is being suggested in the draft we put out, that's something that each of the drafts can inherit without any changes. So there's a lot of possible options. I think the comment I would lead with is that BGP has been at BGP4 for some number of years because we found useful and clever ways to incrementally expand things without having to do forklift upgrades and stuff. We're going to run into, I think, the incremental deployment problem is really the use case that sort of settles us one way or the other. You have the microphone?
Okay, thanks for the response. I think I already expressed what my general opinion is, that obviously I am not the possessor of all wisdom, so I may be wrong.
One of the things, Donald and Huevo and Christoph, and I hope Jim's listening to us as well, and other folks, the real question is whether, should we do a clean state? We initially said 2 years ago we do a clean slate, and we thought it'd come right after. If you really can't decide yet, if Jeff's strawman proposals that he put in there are not enough to convince you one way or the other, we'll gladly take proposals on both sides of the FlowSpec V2 versus V1. We're just trying to engage in this. So we're looking for any other feedback. Again, I'm especially asking for operators and implementers.
And I think one of the conversations we're also going to be having as part of this, and let me attempt to fairly channel one of Robert Rashuk's comments. He really wants all this stuff to be done in a FlowSpec V2. He's not terribly forthcoming about a lot of his motivations for why, but I think to sort of fairly summarize at least one of his positions is what we have works fine, don't break it. So the challenge becomes with incremental deployment, where we add things to the existing protocol, how do we ensure that doesn't happen? I try to make sure that as part of the capability bits that we discussed at least one portion of that problem. And part of the discussion I was hoping to motivate during this interim was, what really changes if you have a different format, or if it's in the same, SAFI that just happens to have new features. The code is going to be parsing roughly the same sorts of things. The ability to actually pull out things that have appropriate semantic meaning, if you support a feature in terms of parsing but not deployment, well, that's what the FlowSpec capability bits were for. With the V2 proposal, we theoretically can start sending stuff around all around the network with components that just completely are not understood, and that can be distributed on a multi-hop basis. But you still at that point have the incremental deployment scenario of what happens if a particular set of devices in that flooding domain don't understand what to do with that filter.
I'll ask one other question besides the incremental. How many people feel that the action ordering, and Jeff, maybe you can go to the action ordering slide.
Let's see here.
Are something we need to carefully think through. When I did the first hand wave spec, and Jeff was that comment on being a hand wave for the action rules was from me as well as Jeff. We really didn't go through, you do this action, then you do this action, what happens if you work on that? Are people using interface set with path redirect, with other things that we should work on? What's a typical, can someone give me a typical action that gets used inside of a network that they're working with that they typically use? Is it mostly block?
Yeah, in my experience, the most common ones are rate limit, including discard, and also redirect, often VRF or IP, for purposes of traffic scrubbing. Christoph, you have the microphone.
Say it's actually what we're using here in the network is basically rate limit to some specific rate until discard completely, assigned to a different quality of service queue, like is it called, I don't remember the name for this action, and the third thing is send the traffic off into different VRF. Basically, it's the three actions. Basically, isn't that all of them? No, there's one more, I think. But all those actions can interoperate without any problem, usually, because it doesn't depend there is no question about ordering of the actions. It's just a question of ordering of the rules, which sometimes gets really tricky because you don't have an explicit ordering, and this could be really a good feature even for current deployments. But I think that some of the features that are out there, like these new drafts, they don't address the current use case, which is mostly DDoS mitigation. So maybe it makes sense to keep FlowSpec version 1 somehow in place and use FlowSpec v2 for a different set of use cases. So I think that there will be some both FlowSpec. If we have a FlowSpec v2, we will have FlowSpec version 1 still in the network for quite a long time. Did I answer some questions? Yeah, maybe.
Providing useful input on the use case for V1 and V2, Christoph. Thank you. Any other questions, Jeff, for Christoph?
No, let's go ahead and just work our way through the queue and let our people talk. Haibo, you have the microphone.
Hello. First, I respond to the question that as the providers I have discussed, the most tactically action is discard, remark the SAP, and redirect IP. These three is I have discussed when the provider has used. And another about the term order. That some providers have submit some requirements to us. We want the term order to order the rules, not for component and for actions. And also I have saw that Jeff have submit a draft is like this. Okay, this is my comment. Thank you.
Thank you,
Okay,
Haibo.
well, I'm not clear about the last comment. You mentioned that Jeff submitted a specific draft. Could you let us know what draft you're referring to?
Term order. Yeah, I think that draft is yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, Weibo. We appreciate that.
Yeah.
Warren, I think you're up.
Yep. I've got very little to add other than plus lots to what Christoph said. And this is commonly used when people are under DOS and they want to send stuff to scrubbers, or sometimes change QoS so that important stuff gets through and less important stuff doesn't. So not a particularly useful comment other than +1.
Sergey, you have the mic.
Okay.
We can hear you.
Okay, perfect. So sorry I missed your call out earlier. So I just want to say two things here. So in my opinion, we're still doing a very major change if, regardless of how we proceed with changing the version 1 or introducing a version 2. And while it's true, you say, if we adopt the capability bits, we can do it in a relatively safe manner. I still believe the interoperability between the old version 1 and the new version 1 will be challenging, at least because of the route reflector use case. Because when you have flow spec peering between your PE devices and route reflectors, you already got this fragmentation problem where some of the PE devices will be on one software release, some of the PE devices will be from a different set of vendors, and so on and so forth. And my second point is more a philosophical one, is basically we introduce a second version of flow spec regardless, because just of the amount of new features which will be adopted. And the drafts which we currently have in queue, it's only the beginning, and I'm pretty sure there are a lot of other ideas of how to use and abuse flow spec. So I think it's just a more nicer and cleaner solution to start to focus on version 2 work earlier rather than later.
Okay, if I could try to summarize that, since I don't know if anybody else heard microphone breaking up. Your second point effectively is that regardless of whether we do this as an incremental change or in a new SAFI, it's a big piece of work no matter what. Why not just simply do it in the new SAFI?
First point is about interoperability. So I still believe even with capabilities, it will be very challenging to implement it the right way.
I'm sorry, you broke up for the last half of that.
Give me a second. Let me check my mic.
What I heard today is that regardless of what we do with this, whether we use the capability bits or not, or term ordering, it will still be a major problem with interoperability between various functions of the V1 and a revised V1. Did I get that correctly, Sergey?
Well, I'm not saying it will be a major issue, but it could be when you have a use case where route reflector is used to distribute flow spec routes.
So I'd like to ask further detail in that question based on how you responded to the adoption poll. So I understand the distribution point for passing the routes through a route reflector. You know, that's probably one of the easiest use cases for FlowSpec v2. But the one that I keep work my way back to is once that's been dealt with, your larger challenge is all of these interactions with new features based on inconsistent support within a FlowSpec domain. Did you have any specific thoughts about that based on the opinion you gave earlier?
Sorry, I missed the first half of your question. Can you repeat it?
Yes. So we understand that one of the nice things about a FlowSpec v2 is that it's route reflector clean upfront. So it's easy to deploy.
Yeah.
But that's mostly a minor encoding problem. Once that's been dealt with, the bigger problem is inconsistent feature support for new components in a domain. Did you have any thoughts about that? How does FlowSpec v2 make that piece easier?
Well, I mean, there's of course work to do, and you know better than me ways to do it. So we definitely need some kind of capability signaling in FlowSpec version 2. And how to do it, of course, it's an open question for discussion. At this point, I don't have a specific solution or a specific preference how to do it.
Okay. The motivation for asking that specific question, again, comes to, does a FlowSpec v2 format really help us with the wider problem? I think what you're answering is you don't have an opinion on that.
Yeah, so I'm not saying the format which was proposed earlier definitely solves all the challenges or is strictly better than what we have now. I just want my main motivation is just to avoid further fragmentation with version 1, and we already have plenty of fragmentation between different supported capabilities, and for some operators it was a major pain point for quite a while.
Okay, that is a fair point.
And so, Sergey, this pain point is because you get two implementations and they don't really interoperate correctly in the V1. Sergey, we're really appreciating this feedback. We're trying to sort through the requirements we would have for a V2.
Well, from my experience, from what I have seen deployed in the field, there were two kinds of issues. The first kind was just because of the inconsistent implementation of FlowSpec v1 on different platforms in different vendors. And the first pain point is just a different capabilities in terms of what each vendor does support from version 1. So even the basic things like what fields can you use in the filtering, it's not consistent across different ecosystems.
And if I could try to wake up somebody else to offer operational comment, Jimutaro, we obviously have bit of a stake in what incremental deployment ends up looking like. Did you have any thoughts about the current state of things versus maybe what we might want later on? Okay, we may have caught Jim sleeping as well.
We really are trying to listen to feedback before we go into the next round of FlowSpec. Let me ask for one out of Juan. Juan, is there anything based on your background that are problems that we haven't addressed with the 3 variants of FlowSpec we put forward to the ISG, the OID, the V6, and the V4? Okay. If you're not sure how to put yourself in the queue, if you just want to even respond in the chat window, Jeff and I will forward it. Okay. Let me ask one other question. Shriram, do you have any issues that you've learned based on your security investigations with FlowSpec?
Yeah, the microphone. And we currently do not hear you.
Shriram, we're not hearing you. You might want to try your microphone.
And we still do not hear you, Shriram.
Yep. Shriram, we're not hearing you. We're missing you. Christoph is in the microphone queue as well.
I wonder if, because I was thinking about this this use cases. Currently, we do have this IPv4, IPv6 DDoS mitigation use case, either in global routing table or in VRF. Most of the drafts, if I'm through those drafts, are addressing like different use cases, like L2 VPN and VXLAN or segment routing, whatever. Is it fair to say that if we are going for a FlowSpec V2, why don't we? I'm not sure if there's too much needed for this DDoS mitigation use case for IP and IPv6 to be added to the current FlowSpec version 1. So if we get like some explicit term ordering, and we may not need any other additional match types. So is it fair to say we can use FlowSpec V2 maybe for new use cases and keep FlowSpec version 1 as it is in place, and add maybe some minor features that are needed without breaking as Robert suggested, without breaking too much?
That is a potential. That's the feedback. That's the feedback that we can specifically ask to the working group, both on the list and at the next ITF. We were trying, this interim was to just provide an open door for people to have long discussions. As you all realize, once we get to an ITF with the virtual ITFs, our time is very limited. So that's a possibility. And Jeff, I guess we'll take an action item to ask that question to the list. You know, limiting the V1 use case to just simply DDoS, and focusing stuff there and putting everything that's new into V2. Donald's V2 can go on a different SAFI. Jeff, did you have any other comments?
I do have a comment. Let's let Shriram try to make his comment first, and then I'll come back to Christoph's. Shriram, care to try again?
You can hear me now, Jeff?
We can.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, sorry, earlier I had 2 levels of unmuting and I had to do 2 levels of unmuting and I forgot one of them. So thanks for the question, Sue. I think you're referring to the Nist security recommendations, that special publication 800-189 that I and Doug Montgomery wrote about 1.5 years back. And at that time, we included some of the security recommendations there that make use of FlowSpec for DDoS mitigation. So since then, I have not gone back to that draft to update it. We will update it periodically, once every maybe 2 or 3 years. And also I need to catch up on lots of things related to FlowSpec, the more recent developments. So yes, I do not have anything new to add there with regard to your question about the security considerations, but I'll keep my eyes open towards it.
Do you want to simply highlight any of those recommendations as we go forward, Shriram?
Okay, sure. I will take a look back into the security recommendations there in that 800-189, and I can post a comment or two on the IDR list. So I'll let you know if I have something.
That would be good. The chairs are really trying to firm up our foundation of V1 or V2.
Sure. Okay. So while I have the microphone, Jeff, can I ask one other question?
Certainly.
So on one of your slides, you mentioned draft V2 hand waves, throw it into a wide community. Is that something still on the table?
That's still a thing to be addressed, although as we sort of work through the discussion points about the current actions that people actually make use of, we don't really have a very large number of these things, although I think that the NVO3 and L2 VPN use cases motivate things, I think, a little bit differently. So as an example, this is a place where Donald, I think, can supply us with a little bit of the thinking is that they've been doing is they've worked on their documents. Mostly what we've seen out of desired actions for firewalls, since that's the component that is being interacted with, is either some level of rate shaping, queue adjustment for via DSCP is what we currently have in the base document, redirection functionality either into a VRF or via an IP address to a tunnel endpoint. We're also seeing documents that are there that are intended to interact directly with things at L2 VPN and at more generic tunnel-based mechanisms. So while I don't personally expect to see a large number of additional new actions show up, because these are things that would need to be widely supported in terms of firewall functionality, I think those documents do make some suggestions that we're going to start seeing further interactions with even those base functionalities. As an example, if you were to do redirect in the NV03 no draft context, what happens if you need to redirect it using a specific NCAPS? Does that need to interact with a feature such as the tunnel NCAPS or RFC? So I don't think we're completely going to be free of need for further features, but as we start adding them, we have the challenges of what the precedents for the various orders end up being.
Okay, thank you, Jeff.
Thanks. So I do want to come back to Christoph's point. Taking the perspective that we're trying to keep FlowSpec v1 effectively focused on the DDoS cases and maybe not worry about anything that's a fancier use case. And we don't have a huge number of documents that have been proposing additional features. As an example, I've seen Juniper has one specifically for interacting with firewall matching based on payload regular expressions. This is a common feature implemented by certain types of DDoS mitigation tunnel endpoint devices. I've seen a proposal for interaction with service function chaining. But that said, we're not seeing a huge number of proposals. And this raises, I think, two interesting points. The first one is that people have avoided proposing new things because we've told them the doors are locked and there's no way for them to do things. So there is a possibility that once we say there is a FlowSpec v2 and we provide some well thought through scenarios about how they can interact with FlowSpec v1, we may see a surge of no interest in new features. So that's a possibility, but it's speculation. The second point that I find sort of an interesting one is we've had at least two pieces of commentary that we'd like to keep FlowSpec v1 focused on the existing DDoS cases. But the term order feature from FlowSpec v2 is a really motivating thing. So a question I have for this forum, and we'll certainly take it to the wider working group list, if we were to take, as an example, the term order draft that suggested here, which makes a relatively minor change to the FlowSpec NLRI. It just simply needs a capability to signal that it's able to be used. If this was a standalone feature and didn't enable other broader use cases, would people find that an interesting and useful thing? And the piece I'll lead with is that for the other SAFIs that we have for L2 VPN and NV03, that would allow those features to also gain benefit without having to go for a full new NLRI type. So, any comments from people on via microphone or chat? Sue?
So I think that unless we can find some additional points, Jeff, I think we have two action items here to query. You had one for, looks like he's and Linda are looking for a point. I think I'll put a pause in mine and my summary and wait till we hear some more input. Go ahead, folks.
G, you have the mic.
Regarding the ordering issue, I see actually we have several things related to the ordering. One is the ordering of the matching rules, and the other one is the ordering of the actions. And in Jeff's new draft term order, this, in my understanding, is about the ordering of the FlowSpec rules, right? So there are three different type of ordering requirements which we target to solve in both the new draft and the FlowSpec v2. perhaps we can have some further analysis about the use cases of each one and clarify that in the drafts so that we can have better understanding about all these ordering related requirements.
Okay. My quick response to that is the term ordering is intended to be separate from the rule ordering for actions. I would not think to mix the two in the same document, but certainly we can start working group discussion on what do we want to do about action ordering.
Yeah, I see the FlowSpec v2 has ordering in both the components and also the actions. And I know the ordering in the term order draft is something different.
Mm-hmm. Linda, you have the microphone.
Hi, Jeff. Just regarding to what you mentioned that there's no new ways being proposed for using FlowSpec. We have a draft in the RTG working group specify a new way of using FlowSpec for passing the policies between the application controller to the ingress of connecting to the 5G UTF node. And just want to point that out. We do have a new way to use FlowSpec.
Okay. So I guess my question, not having read the draft, is the current flow spec seen as being adequate for that, or is there some suggestion from that work that there may need to be extensions?
You know what? Maybe we'll propose that, send that to the IDR working group mailing list, because right now it's just a document in the RTG working group. We have multiple ways of doing the same thing and compare them. So we will study it and then see if the flow spec V1 is enough or not. So put that on the mailing list to discuss. I just want to point that out.
Okay, thank you. Ji, you have the microphone again. So, okay, took his hand down. So did you want to move back to the two action items you were discussing?
Yes, you had an action item to explain something for G when he was talking about the distribution, incomplete distribution in the route reflector, and I thought also the targeted information. Did you have that in your action item? That's one action item. The other action item is to query the working group for use cases and see the use cases people want to see in V1 and V2. And the third one was Shriram was going to post information on security that he got from his previous research. Those are the three things I had as far as things we needed to follow up with. We're still, it sounds like from Donald that we ought to just open, take in a new FlowSpec V2 specifications and any other specifications for revisions for V1. I'm not really sure how to do the V1 specifications outside of the very targeted things we do with yours, Jeff, because we've sort of had a square box around that. Any comments or thoughts on that?
None specifically at this time. I think it overlaps the distribution discussion.
Okay, so do I. Okay, folks, you've given us a lot to think about. Does anyone have any other comments? We had hoped everyone was ready to think about V2 versus V1, it looks like we're going to have to dip back and ask things. If you do want to try proposals for V2, maybe that'll help us come to a clear definition. I'd like to see some sort of direction for our V2, so we just sort of don't head off into encodings. I'd like to see what we'd like to do. Anything else before we close the interim? We will have an interim again in 2 weeks to discuss BGP auto configuration. That interim will have the same thing. We've had our design team, we've had requirements, we've had lots of debate on the list, and we've really come to no solid conclusion. So the interim is a time and a place where if you have a draft or if you have something you want to discuss regarding that, we're going to talk about requirements, but if you think a draft is going to help us get to requirements or something like that, go ahead and at least send it to the chairs. These interims are our only place to do a lengthy discussion, since when we get to the IETF meetings, our time is very limited for each draft. So we're going to try to get the discussion into these points. If you have something that you'd like to propose for the interim, go ahead and send the IDR chairs your proposal and we'll see if we can fit it in. But we're trying to close off on these two topics. Topic 1 from this interim is flow spec. Topic 2 from interim 2 weeks is the BGP auto configuration. And we thank you for joining us. Kayer or Jeff, any final comments?
Nothing from me.
Alvaro, any comments from you?
No, Sue, thank you.
Thank you for working with us, you all, and we'll try to get a good set of notes out. Have a great day.
See you on the mailing list.
See you on the mailing list. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Fine.